When my parents told me we were moving to the outskirts of town, I couldn't believe it. I was 15, and the thought of leaving my friends, my school, and pretty much everything I cared about to live in some rundown house in the middle of nowhere felt like the worst idea they'd ever had. But my parents, always chasing the next great deal, insisted it was for the best. The house was dirt cheap, came with a massive yard, and had character, as my mom put it. The first time I saw it, I understood why it was so cheap. It wasn't just old, it looked forgotten. The paint on the siding was peeling in long, jagged strips, the windows were smudged and cloudy, and the roof sagged slightly, as if the house itself was tired of standing. It sat at the end of a long, dusty road with no neighbors in sight, surrounded by a thick wall of trees that seemed to lean in like they were trying to swallow the place whole. My parents, of course, loved it. "Just think of all the space," my dad said, gesturing at the overgrown yard. Mom was already talking about planting a garden and repainting the shutters. I just wanted to go home, back to my friends and the life I knew. But there was no point in arguing. The inside wasn't much better. The floors creaked with every step, the wallpaper was faded and peeling, and the air smelled like damp wood and something faintly metallic. My room was upstairs at the end of a narrow, dim hallway. It was small, with a single window that looked out over the backyard, where the trees stretched endlessly into the distance. The previous owners had left an old wooden desk in the corner, and when I opened the drawers, I found them full of dust and a few dead spiders. Great. That night, after hours of unpacking and pretending to be fine, I collapsed into bed, exhausted but uneasy. The house was too quiet. Back in our old neighborhood, I'd grown used to the hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, or the distant wail of a siren. Here, there was nothing. Just silence. It wasn't peaceful, though, it was heavy, almost suffocating, like the house was holding its breath. I must have dozed off, but I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again, a faint creaking, like someone walking across the floor. My heart started pounding. The sound was coming from downstairs, slow and deliberate, each step measured. I told myself it was probably one of my parents, maybe getting a glass of water or checking on something, but it didn't feel right. I sat up and listened, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The sound moved toward the stairs, each creak louder than the last. I leaned out of bed and tiptoed to my door, cracking it open just enough to peek out. The hallway was pitch dark. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The creaking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, so absolute it made my ears ring. Then I heard something else, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against wood, or leaves, caught in a breeze. But there was no breeze. I shut the door and locked it, my hands shaking. I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to hear anything, but the house had gone still again. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, too scared to move, until exhaustion finally dragged me back to sleep. The next morning, I told my parents about the noises. They laughed it off, of course. "It's an old house," Dad said. "They settle. They creak. You'll get used to it." Mom suggested I'd had a bad dream. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something had moved through the house that night, and it wasn't just the wind or creaking floorboards. That was the first time I felt it, the sense that the house was alive, not in the way plants or animals are, but in a quiet, watchful way. Like it had been waiting. And now we were here. The creaking floors from the first night weren't the end of it, far from it. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening around the house. Little things, at first, like the lights flickering in the kitchen or a door that I swore I'd closed being wide open when I came back to it. My parents blamed it on the house's age. "It's just quirks," my mom said with a smile. "Old houses have personality." If that was personality, I wanted nothing to do with it. The whispers started about a week after we moved in. They weren't loud, more like the faint murmur of a conversation you couldn't quite make out. It usually happened late at night, just when I was about to fall asleep. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But it wasn't. The whispers were always there, low and steady, like someone was standing just outside my door. One night, I finally worked up the courage to investigate. I threw open my door, half expecting to find my dad playing a prank on me. But the hallway was empty, the house completely still. I even checked my parents' room, but they were both fast asleep. I wanted to believe it was just the wind or maybe the house settling again, but deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just the sounds either. There was this feeling that crept over me whenever I was alone, like I was being watched. The worst was in the basement. My dad was storing some of the unpacked boxes down there, so I had to help him carry things in and out. Every time I stepped into that cold, dim space, I felt like someone was standing just behind me, watching silently. The air down there was different, heavier somehow, and the smell of damp earth was stronger than anywhere else in the house. Then there was the backyard. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, finishing up some homework while my parents watched TV in the next room. The sun had just set, and the backyard was bathed in that strange twilight glow. I glanced out the window and saw something, or at least, I thought I did. A shadow, just at the edge of the trees, standing perfectly still. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But as I stared, the shadow seemed to shift, almost like it was leaning closer. I blinked, and it was gone. Just like that. I told myself it had been a tree or a bush swaying in the breeze, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been watching me. The next morning, I decided to look up the house online. It wasn't hard to find. Apparently, it had been empty for a few years before we moved in. The last owner had vanished, just disappeared one night, leaving everything behind. The police found his car in the driveway, his wallet on the kitchen counter, and a half-eaten sandwich still on the table. There were no signs of foul play, no clues about where he might have gone. He was just gone. When I told my parents, they shrugged it off. People leave, my dad said. Maybe he wanted a new start. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why would someone just walk away from their life like that? And why did it feel like the house hadn't forgotten him? Things only got worse from there. By the time I found the bundle of papers, the house's strangeness had gone from unsettling to downright nerve-wracking. The whispers were louder now, not constant but frequent enough to keep me on edge. Sometimes I'd hear my name, faint and stretched out, like it was being pulled through the trees in the backyard. My parents didn't hear it, of course. "You're just imagining things," Mom said with her usual bright but dismissive tone. Dad just grunted and went back to his yard work. But the papers in the desk were different. They were real, solid, and unnerving. They weren't letters or a diary like I'd hoped, nothing straightforward or comforting. Instead, they were maps. Hand-drawn, rough, and incomplete, they seemed to chart the woods behind the house. Some parts were detailed with strange little symbols, X's, spirals, and odd geometric patterns, while other parts just trailed off into nothingness. What freaked me out the most was the writing scrawled in the margins. "Stay on the path," one note read. Another warned, "It doesn't like the light." One particularly chilling line said, "If you hear it call, don't answer." I tried showing the maps to my parents, hoping for some kind of rational explanation, but they waved it off as kids messing around or just another reason to clean out that old desk. I could tell they were getting annoyed with my paranoia, so I stopped mentioning it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever drew those maps had lived in this house. And they'd seen something. One night, I decided to test the notes. The idea felt ridiculous, but I'd been hearing those whispers again, faintly echoing through the hallways, so I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the backyard. The moon was high, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to shift as I walked. I followed the map as best I could, though the paths on it didn't match the overgrown trails. I'd only gone a little way in when I saw it, a shadow that wasn't mine. It was long, tall, and oddly shaped, moving across the dirt despite there being no one near me. The light from my flashlight caught on it, and for a moment, it stopped moving. Like it was watching me. Then it darted off, quick and fluid, vanishing deeper into the woods. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to the house without tripping over my own feet, but the second I slammed the back door shut, the whisper stopped. The house fell silent again, heavy and oppressive. That night, I didn't sleep. But I started noticing more shadows. In the hall, on the walls, even outside my window. They didn't move unless I did, like they were waiting for something. And I couldn't help but feel like the house wanted me to notice them. To be continued. The next few days were a mix of avoidance and obsession. I couldn't stop staring at the map, tracing the trails and symbols over and over again, trying to decipher what they meant. I couldn't bring myself to venture into the woods again, but the pull was undeniable. The cryptic notes, the strange warnings, they felt like a challenge, a riddle begging to be solved. Then came the dreams. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with flashes of the forest burned into my mind. In my dreams, I was always walking down a narrow path surrounded by trees. The whispers were there, louder than ever, calling my name from the shadows. But each time I turned to look, I'd see nothing, just the endless woods stretching on and on. The only constant was a sense of being followed. On the fourth night, the dream changed. This time, I was holding the map. The trails and symbols were glowing faintly, like embers in the dark. A new note appeared in the margins, written in handwriting I didn't recognize: "You're close. Keep going." When I woke up, I could still hear the faint echo of the words. The next morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the map, my flashlight, and a notebook, and headed out into the backyard. The woods were quieter than I remembered, as if they were holding their breath. I followed the map more carefully this time, using the symbols and X's to guide me. After what felt like hours of walking, I came to a clearing. At the center was a large, flat stone covered in carvings, spirals, X's, and geometric patterns just like the ones on the map. The air felt heavier here, like the clearing was alive. That's when I saw it, something dark, standing just beyond the tree line. Its shape was wrong, shifting and twisting like smoke. It didn't move closer, but I could feel it watching. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. Instead, I pulled out my notebook and began sketching the carvings on the stone. The dark shape stayed still, as if it were waiting. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, the whispers followed me all the way back to the house. That night, I opened the map again. A new symbol had appeared near the clearing, faint but unmistakable, a spiral, surrounded by smaller X's. Beneath it was another note: "It's waking up." The mystery deepens. What's the connection between the map and the dark figure? And what exactly is waking up? I'm asked myself. The moment I saw the new note, I knew the stakes had changed. It's waking up. What was waking up? And why did it feel like the map was pulling me deeper into something I didn't understand, and maybe couldn't escape? I didn't sleep that night, too afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Even the usual groans of the floorboards seemed to hold back, like the house itself was bracing for something. My parents had left for town, blissfully unaware of everything. I felt a strange relief they were gone. This thing, whatever it was, felt personal now, like it was just between me and the house, or the woods, or the thing in the shadows. I decided to go back to the clearing. I didn't want to, I had to. It was like the map had burned into my brain, and the only way to shake the feeling was to finish what I'd started. When I reached the clearing, the air was heavier than before, pressing against my chest like a vice. The carvings on the stone were glowing faintly now, pulsing with a rhythm that felt alive. The dark figure was there, too, standing closer, this time. Its form shifted and blurred, like smoke caught in a storm, and its purple, orb-like eyes locked onto me. I held up the map, unsure why, but it felt right. The symbols on the map began to glow, mirroring the ones on the stone. The figure tilted its head, as if curious. And then it spoke, not with words, but with thoughts. They poured into my mind like a flood, images of the forest swallowing up the land, of the house being built over something ancient and angry, and of people, many people, who had come before me, all drawn by the same map. "You woke it," the voice said. It wasn't accusing, it was resigned, almost sad. "Now you must seal it." "What? How?" I asked aloud, my voice trembling. The figure pointed to the stone. There was a hollow in its center I hadn't noticed before, just big enough for the map. I hesitated, the weight of the map heavy in my hands now, as if it didn't want to leave me. "You must," the voice urged. "Or it will consume everything." I placed the map in the hollow. The moment it touched the stone, the glowing intensified, blinding me. A low, guttural rumble shook the ground, and I stumbled back, falling onto the mossy earth. The dark figure stepped closer, its smoky form beginning to unravel, its purple eyes fading as if the map was pulling it apart. The light from the stone grew brighter until it burst, a wave of energy rippling out through the trees. And then, silence. The figure was gone. The stone was cold and dull. The woods, for the first time, felt like just woods, quiet, still, and normal. When I got back to the house, the oppressive atmosphere was gone. The whispers, the shadows, even the heavy silence had vanished. My parents returned later, cheerfully oblivious, and I didn't tell them what happened. What could I say? That night, I slept for the first time in weeks. But in my dreams, I saw the map again, back in the hollow of the stone, its symbols faint, but still there. Waiting. Maybe the house was safe now. Maybe the forest was just a forest. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure, whatever I'd sealed away, it wasn't gone. Just asleep. And that's where it ends, for now. Would you go back to the house? Or leave the map buried forever?